The main purpose of this module is to develop a clear and realistic idea of exactly what it is you want to achieve. The more clearly you know, the better your chances of getting there. And we want to make sure that what we're going to be doing in the course with biofeedback and mindfulness connects to your personal goals and aspirations. Now, sometimes problems can't be solved in their own terms or at their own level. It's as if none of the options currently on the table seems to work. This is very common when the problem is to do with the mind. Take an example, insomnia. You're lying in bed trying to get to sleep, but it's just not happening. And the harder you try, the further away you seem to be. We've probably all had this experience at some point. In that case, what you have to do is find a new way of looking at the context of the problem. Find a new insight that opens up new possibilities or new ways of thinking about what's needed. In psychology, this process is called reframing. I want to emphasize that reframing is in no way a trivial thing. In particular, how you view stress has profound consequences in terms of how it affects you, as we'll see later. So this module has 3 parts. In part 1, we'll focus on problems, getting a detailed view of exactly what's happening. Then in part 2, we'll look at goals or solutions, and in particular formulating realistic goals based on the problems. Then in part 3, we'll do some reframing of problems. This means going a little deeper into the nature of the problems so we can find new ways of thinking about what's needed. This module is of course preparatory to the work with biofeedback. No biofeedback yet, but it'll still be practical in the sense that I'm going to get you to think about your issues and write a few things down. So there'll be a sequence of pen and paper exercises. And I want to list 3 categories. The first is what you feel, so feelings, sensations, physical symptoms. So broadly speaking, this is experience that has at least something to do with the body. So examples might be feeling tense or tight or having a pain. The second category is to do with thinking. So maybe your problems involved thinking about bad things that are going to happen or might happen. But it's not just what you think, but how you think. Thoughts can be racing or obsessive or repetitive. Now, I also want to include in this category other aspects of cognitive functioning, such as memory and focus, and in particular how you focus and what you focus on. That's a common part of problems. The third category is what you do. It's about your behaviours and activities. Now, at this point, you might be starting to think about what you wrote in the last exercise, which was on defining emotional experience and how it relates to these 3 categories. And yes, that's coming in a future exercise. So that's going to be to go back and classify what you've just written, but not just yet. First, I want to go a little deeper into these 3 categories. One common area for confusion is the distinction between thoughts and feelings. As a therapist, I often ask my clients how they feel, and they can say things like, "I'm useless at my job," or something like that. They're actually telling me what they think, not how they feel. "I'm useless at my job" is a thought, not a feeling. Of course, thoughts like that usually carry feelings with them. If you think that you can't do your job, you're going to feel bad. And this is what's implicitly meant. If you say, "I feel like I'm useless at my job," you're implicitly telling me you feel bad about it, but you're not explicitly saying it. I have to infer it. But how exactly do you feel bad? Do you feel anxious because you're going to get sacked, or despairing, or self-loathing, or all of these, or maybe you're just not quite sure? So it's useful to be clear on the distinction between thoughts and feelings. So let's really spell it out. Now, in this table, we've got characteristics of thoughts on the left and feelings on the right. First, thoughts are expressed in language as sentences or phrases, such as "I'll never be any good," or "My boss doesn't like me," or "I might get the sack." Feelings can be expressed with words too, but the words tend to be single words rather than phrases or sentences, and they're just essentially labels for the feelings. So feelings are things like calm, tense, hurt, or butterflies in the stomach. Thoughts can be true or false, or at least it makes sense to ask the question. So it may be true that my boss doesn't like me, or it may not be. but it doesn't make sense to speak of a feeling as true or false. So you can't say butterflies in the stomach is true or false in itself. Feelings can have the quality of being either pleasurable or painful. So feeling calm is pleasurable. Tense is more painful, or at least uncomfortable. But thoughts in themselves aren't pleasurable or painful. Of course, they can trigger feelings which are pleasurable or painful, but that's one step removed. So implicit in what I've been saying is the idea that thoughts and feelings condition each other. Thinking that you'll never be good enough or that nobody likes you will lead to feeling bad. So the thought is, I'll never be good enough, and the feeling is bad. So this much is fairly straightforward and incontrovertible. And indeed, CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, is based on that connection or that relationship. But what may be less obvious is that feelings also condition thoughts. So you're outside the examination hall and you're nervous and you have the thought, I'm going to fail this exam. Now you may believe that because you're already anxious. Another example, you're giving a presentation at the office. You're anxious, and as you stand up to begin your presentation, you think, everybody thinks I'm no good at my job. Now, you wouldn't think that 3 hours later when you've calmed down again, but in the heat of the moment, you believe it because you're anxious. Now, of course, thinking it is likely to make you more anxious. So we've got a loop here, and you can go round and round, and to some extent, it's a bit chicken and egg in terms of what comes first. This is a fuller picture, representing the fact that there are external triggers too, such as actually giving a presentation or actually taking the exam. Now, I want to briefly make another point here, which is that often thoughts can take the form of questions. So you might think, what if I fail the exam? Or what if my boss thinks my presentation is rubbish? Well, when we think such thoughts, we tend to implicitly answer ourselves with a feeling. So, what if I fail the exam leads to an anxious feeling, as though the mind is answering the question, well, it would feel like this. We actually do this all the time, quite automatically. It's a kind of simulation of experience, and it's an important topic that we'll come back to later on. Now, one last point here. We can relate this back to the idea of the mind-body connection, which we first met in the introduction. The point is, feelings tend to involve physiological changes or bodily responses. They tend to be embodied as physiological responses. Or perhaps it's more accurate to say that bodily responses are experienced as feelings, while thoughts are amongst the things that can trigger the physiological changes. Now, you might have noticed that I didn't use emotion as one of the three categories that we used in the last exercise. So I did use the word feeling, which a lot of people use synonymously with emotion, but I'm actually making a distinction, and it's time to clarify what that is. Really, my main point is that emotion is, well, it's really quite a broad concept, maybe even somewhat vague and diffuse. It encompasses all the categories that we've been talking about. Emotions tend to have one-word labels. The most basic ones are fear, anger, joy, surprise, sadness, and disgust. These are known as the primary emotions in psychology. Now, perhaps the most definitive characteristic of emotion is that there's a body response that we can feel. So in anxiety, the heart pounds or skips a beat, we sweat, we tighten up, we may blanch, or we may hold our breath. Facial expression is part of this body response, so smiling, frowning, etc. So feeling is our perception of these body responses. Feelings can be subtle and intangible at times, but essentially they're something to do with the body. But there's more to emotion than feeling. There's also a tendency to think along certain lines and in certain ways. So in anxiety, you think about the bad things that might happen. That's what we call worrying. You might have racing or agitated thoughts that won't switch off. In anger, you might be thinking about revenge, while in sadness, your thinking might be slow and repetitive. Emotions move us to act in certain ways. I think this is also quite definitive. In anger, you want to shout or maybe something even more violent. In sadness, you tend to slump and look at the floor and really not do very much. Inspiration moves you to act positively. Emotions also affect how we pay attention. Anxiety makes us on edge, hypervigilant, maybe quite narrow in our awareness. In anger and resentment, we focus on how people have done us wrong. Positive emotions expand and broaden awareness. We literally take more in, and they also tend to make us more socially aware. So these are the things that you might have written about in response to the earlier exercise. But it wouldn't be surprising if you didn't get everything I've mentioned. That's because different people have their own styles of doing emotion. For example, some people are by temperament not tuned in to what their body's doing. They live more in their heads or in their thoughts. So they tend to notice emotional responses in how they think and focus, which they might not necessarily recognize as being emotional at all. If this is you, it's not that there's a right way and a wrong way to experience emotions or not experience emotions, but the point is you've potentially got a lot to gain by becoming more aware of body responses, which are likely to be happening whether you're aware of them or not, because awareness gives you some basis for having an influence and thus affecting how you think and how you feel. I think it's useful to think about emotions like this, because if you have a difficult emotion like anxiety, then like any broad project, it's good to break it down into component parts and tackle each one separately as needed. And it's also good to be able to see your own personal patterns so that you can tailor your strategies accordingly. The next point is that problems, whether they're emotional or not, don't happen in a vacuum. They happen in some particular context in your life, probably various different contexts. And in these different contexts, the problems have different intensities, or they affect you to a greater or lesser extent. Another way of saying this is that how stressful the circumstances are determines how badly you're affected. This is particularly true of problems that are essentially emotional in nature. Take anxiety. Anxiety is an emotion. That means it's a response to a trigger or a set of triggers. So it might be that for you, going to the dentist is the scariest thing in the world, but going to see your GP is quite manageable. If the dentist is 9 out of 10 on the anxiety scale, the doctor might be 2 out of 10, say. Or it could be that getting on an aeroplane is the worst thing for you, a 10 out of 10. But getting on a bus is a 1 out of 10. But even the bus is not quite 0. That's the interesting thing. So anxiety, like any emotion, is not black and white. It's a matter of degree. Now this is going to be useful to bear in mind. Why? Well, essentially because when you're learning any skill, you start with easier challenges and then move on to harder stuff as your skill level grows. This is an important point that we'll come back to later in the course. So to recap, what we've been doing here is rating the intensity of emotions or other problems. This is a useful thing to be able to do, in part because it gives us a way of judging your progress towards a successful outcome for your project. And that's important for any project, because if you're not making progress, you need to respond to that and do something different. And conversely, when you see that you are making progress, then your confidence will grow. So you're not going to just wake up one day and find that your problem is gone. You need to have some way of judging progress. And there are a few variables to consider. The first is the intensity of the problem. That's what we've just been talking about in the last exercise. But additionally, there's frequency of occurrence of the problem. So if your problem is panic, well, a panic attack is a panic attack, but you might see them getting less and less frequent as time goes on, and that would be progress. And then there's duration of the problem, or how long it takes to recover. Now, I can think of a recent client who had an anger problem. He would lose his temper and then have a blazing row and then spend hours simmering with resentment and regrets. And he found that as his skills developed, he could catch himself more quickly and let go of the negativity much more quickly so that he could recover his equanimity. Another way to judge your progress is to ask to what extent you're living a meaningful life in spite of the problem. This is important if you've sort of put your life on hold because of the problem. Sometimes the bigger problem is that your life is on hold. You're just waiting till you've solved the problem before you live the life that you want. So another client I had would feel that she was doing well, and then an incident would happen that led to her feeling like she hadn't got anywhere. But she wasn't really judging it fairly. She wanted to live a life free of anxiety, almost free of the possibility of anxiety, which is just not realistic. And because she didn't get that, she got disheartened and she lost sight of the fact that she was actually handling her anxiety a lot better. So we need to have realistic goals, and that's the topic for the next part of the course.